A contract signed 7 weeks before departure put 8,000 tins of slow poison on 2 ships. Not one of the 129 men who ate from those tins ever came home. 1845. 129 men sail for the Northwest Passage. Everyone thinks they froze. The chemistry says otherwise. The proof sat in a frozen grave for 138 years. Number 1 is what I call the 7-week gamble. On April 1st, 1845, the British Admiralty awarded a contract to a Hungarian provisioner named Stephan Goldner. His job was to supply 8,000 tins of preserved meat, soup, and vegetables for the expedition. The problem was that the ships were scheduled to depart on May 19th. That gave Goldner exactly 7 weeks to fill one of the largest food orders in British naval history. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand how canning worked in 1845. Canning was barely 30 years old. The process required cooking food at high temperatures inside sealed metal containers to kill bacteria. The standard method called for heating tins to at least 250 degrees for 7 to 11 hours. But Goldner was running out of time. Evidence from later investigations suggests his workers heated the tins to only 212 degrees for 30 to 75 minutes. That is not even close to enough to kill every spore of Clostridium botulinum, the bacterium that causes botulism. But the cooking was only half the problem. Every single tin had to be sealed shut by hand, using solder. And the solder Goldner's workers used was heavily lead, with as much as 90% lead by weight. They poured it along the interior seams of each can, where it sat in direct contact with the food inside. When investigators later examined tins recovered from the expedition's waste dump on Beechey Island, they described the solder as thick and sloppily applied, dripping like melted candle wax down the inside walls. Some tins had massive lumps of lead solder sitting right in the food. Here's what most people get wrong. Ask yourself, how much lead does it take to cause brain damage? Most people imagine a visible amount, something you could see and avoid. The real answer is 70 micrograms per deciliter of blood. That is less than a grain of sand dissolved in a shot glass. And these men were eating food that had been marinating in lead solder for months. But here's where the chemistry turns truly sinister. Lead doesn't just sit there. When lead contacts acidic food, and most preserved meats and soups are acidic, it undergoes a chemical reaction. The citric and acidic acids in the food dissolve the lead from the solder, pulling lead ions directly into the meal. The longer the food sits in the can, the more lead leaches in. These men carried 3 years of food. By the time they opened a tin that had been sealed for 2 years, the lead concentration inside would have been astronomical. Number 2 is the thermal coffin. In September of 1846, both ships became locked in ice off the western coast of King William Island. They would never sail again. For the next 19 months, 129 men lived inside wooden ships surrounded by Arctic ice, eating from those lead, contaminated tins every single day. The first 3 men died during the winter of 1845 to 1846 at Beechey Island. Their names were John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain. All 3 were buried in the permafrost, which preserved their bodies almost perfectly. But nobody examined them, not for another 138 years. In 1984, a forensic anthropologist named Owen Beattie exhumed those 3 frozen graves. What he found changed everything we knew about the expedition. Torrington's hair showed peak lead levels exceeding 600 parts per million. The normal baseline for Inuit people living in the same region was 22 to 36 parts per million. Torrington had roughly 10 to 20 times the expected amount of lead in his body. All 3 men also showed signs consistent with tuberculosis. Torrington weighed less than 40 kilograms when he died. His body mass index was 15. He had been too sick to work for weeks before his death. Think about what was happening inside those ships. Lead poisoning causes fatigue, confusion, paranoia, abdominal pain, weight loss, and eventually hallucinations and seizures. Tuberculosis was spreading in the cramped quarters. Scurvy was likely setting in as their lemon juice degraded over time. And every meal they ate to keep their strength up was pumping more lead into their blood. The very act of eating was making them sicker. On June 11, 1847, Sir John Franklin himself died aboard the Erebus. His cause of death was never recorded. By April of 1848, 9 officers and 15 men were dead. The remaining 105 men made a decision that sealed their fate. Captain Francis Crozier ordered both ships abandoned. They would march south on foot to the Back River on the Canadian mainland, dragging lifeboats on sledges across the ice. They managed about 1.5 miles per day. Lead poisoned, Starving, riddled with tuberculosis and scurvy, they stumbled across the frozen landscape. Inuit hunters later described watching sick men fall down and die as they walked. Bodies were found scattered along the western coast of King William Island. Cut marks on bones confirmed what the Inuit had reported decades earlier. In their final days, the survivors resorted to cannibalism. Not a single one of the 129 men survived. 0. The ship sat on the ocean floor undiscovered until 2014, when HMS Erebus was finally located. HMS Terror was found 2 years later in 2016. But the real evidence had been sitting in those frozen graves on Beachy Island since 1846. 3 men, perfectly preserved, waiting for someone to ask the right question. It took 138 years. Every engineering disaster starts the same way. Not with a catastrophic failure, but with a small decision that seemed reasonable at the time. A 7-week deadline. A cheaper solder. A shortcut in the cooking process. The physics doesn't care about your schedule. And when you seal poison inside a tin can, the clock starts ticking the moment the lid goes on. If you think a rushed contract from 1845 can't happen today, you should see what happens when modern companies cut the same corners with the materials in your home. That video is right here.